Welcome to the Global Peace Film Festival Lives Online Conversation 2022 Festival Edition. Please join me, Kelly Devine, the Artistic Director, and Nina Strike, the Executive Director, in conversation with the filmmaker Celine Perennias Shimizu behind the film 80 Years Later, which is a part of the 20th anniversary Global Peace Film Festival, which begins our in-person programming September 19th through the 25th, followed immediately by our virtual programming access beginning September 26th through October 2nd. All the information about scheduling and all of our other events can be found at our website, peacefilmfest.org. And now, please join us in welcoming Celine Perennias Shimizu with her impactful and tender family portrait, 80 Years Later.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So let's start. Celine, please tell us about the film.
The film 80 Years Later is composed of multi-generational conversations between two Japanese American families who were incarcerated in World War II. They were both, the two lead subjects were both children. One was 3 years old, one was 16, 17 years old, and their first cousins. And it's really about the racial inheritance of that experience and how families continue to grapple with that legacy.
And Celine, can you talk a bit about your approach to telling this particular story? The things that first occur to me are that this is part of your family history, and also that you are, your academic role. What the intersectionality of those parts of your, of your life in terms of making this film. Could you talk about that approach?
Thank you so much, Nina, Kelly, for such a great question. So I am a Filipinx American immigrant. I came here when I was in my teens from Marcos era Philippines. We were essentially refugees. We left the Philippines within 3 days with really just our backpack, our clothes. So truly uprooted and displaced. I really wanted to make sense of that experience as I was growing up, and I went to UC Berkeley and really became immersed in ethnic studies. And when you're studying Asian American studies in particular, you will hear about the Japanese American incarceration in World War II. It's really a shocking and astounding experience for essentially American citizens, to be imprisoned by the state. And so I learned a lot about that. And I also worked with a pioneering filmmaker and learned how to, make films about repressed moments in history and how we need to learn from them to understand existing power relationships. And so I married into this Japanese American family, and the story became even closer to me in terms of observing how the family, were really relocated to an area away from San Francisco where there were so many Japanese Americans, predominantly, white communities. And I would see photographs of my father-in-law as the only person of color in a group of maybe 30 or 40, white kids in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I would hear from our aunt, Kyo, who was relocated to Chicago, trying to give meaning to her life and make sense of what she went through as a teenager. Her life halted, after high school. She had to figure out where to go. And she devoted her life to a civil rights movement, and the children, they were fourth generation Japanese Americans. We're trying to make sense of this legacy. And so I became, a a close witness to that ongoing question, what does this mean? How did this transform our culture? What gets passed on? What does not get passed on? What becomes sacrificed? What becomes lost? After undergoing, such a betrayal, by the state, by your home. And I realized that it was also my story, as an immigrant to this country, to understand what happened, to other Asian Americans, and how it was really important to understand it as a wound, a national wound, but also a personal wound, within this family, and how, they coped with it. And to observe how, the next generation, the fourth generation, tried to make sense of that experience, an inability to figure out what they inherited from that, what is theirs, and it became complicated with mixed race families. How do you acknowledge this racial identity that was essentially the reason why their family was imprisoned? And then my own children, are fifth generation, essentially Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, and this is also their inheritance. And it also helped me to make sense of how it became very important to me to pass on these traditions that I did not grow up with, that were repressed in my husband's family, and to bring them back, to celebrate Children's Day, on May 5. There are these beautiful traditions of celebrating the resilience and strength of children. And I think what I realized in how I chose to raise my children by recovering these traditions is that we shouldn't turn away from the abundance of our cultures, especially when they have been or are at risk of disappearing, because they really are a source of strength, and they make us feel rich and wealthy, and grounded in terms of who we are, who our ancestors are, and what we carry. And so I think the film is ultimately an invitation for all of us, to acknowledge our heritage and our history.
That's a really powerful way to look at this particular story. And, in particular, for our audiences, and I really do recommend everyone seek this film out if they're not in the Central Florida area and miss it, for them to find other opportunities to talk about that kind of conversation between generations that ends up being captured, however well or awkwardly, in words like identity or heritage, that have this kind of conversation generation to generation about meaning and belonging. And I think that's something that really comes out beautifully in your film.
Yes, I think that was an approach that is very special in this film for me to have chosen to do, I think, because I had not yet seen it in other films about the Japanese American incarceration experience, the ongoingness, the living legacy of it. And there's something so wonderful, about seeing the older generation truly listen to the younger generation in a respectful way, in an openly curious way about how they're experiencing heritage identity, in all of its complicated specificity, and similarly, how the younger generations, I think what they learn from the older generations is to accept ambiguity, not necessarily to say, oh, this is what my identity means, but then to understand that they are able to experience, the assertion of their heritage because their predecessors were really not able to, that it's such a privilege, that they're inheriting, and in both instances, older and younger, middle age, I think what you'll see in the film is that your racial inheritance is both a blessing and a curse at all times, and I wouldn't want us to turn away from it, as painful as it is and as confusing as it is. It's a worthwhile endeavor.
That is such a wonderful point to raise about, I think sometimes some of the defensiveness we get is out of a sense of wanting things to be too neatly packaged
Mhm.
and too neatly defined. And that's not what makes life rich.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the film ends in such a wonderful way when Grandpa says, we don't necessarily have to understand what it means, but talking about it actually, strengthens their bond, And my favorite parts of the film are really the visibility of that grappling, with the past, and, the younger generation hearing from the older generation about how the older people were witnessing the experiences of younger people. You know what I mean? Like, to witness is not just to see, but to really care for what's going on. Like, how did my experience get passed on to my kid? When Grandpa says, I thought we were fine and we were just cruising, until this happened to you. I thought we were done, but I didn't realize that you also were continuing to be excluded in a way, I think, that really pained him. I mean, I think growing up, from San Francisco, growing up in San Francisco, San Mateo, the Bay Area, when you walk around, you're like, wow, there are 27 Japanese restaurants in 9 blocks. That's a reality, that isn't elsewhere. So for him to be uprooted, to a place like Cincinnati, where, at the time it was hard to find Asian food. I mean, which is why their family ended up being the providers of rice and tofu to the tri-state area, because it was just hard, I mean, so they made Japanese food more available to Asians, or rice, Asians overall in the Midwest. There was really something there that was happening about what it means to be American, in terms of food, right? And I think there was so much, I think, terror likely that my father-in-law, experienced in terms of just being so different, that he says that he had to really figured out, a way of being there that ended up excelling above the rest, because one thing that his mother told him was, be very careful, because how you behave will affect how other Japanese Americans are treated. I mean, I can't even imagine that kind of burden, because when he's looking around, he's by himself, essentially, along with his brother. And I mean, when I looked at his yearbook, I mean, there were thousands of students there. He was the only person of color in his school. And, his caption in his yearbook said he was the best boy of the whole school, like best boy, capital B, twice, right? And he was president of the senior class, president of the junior class. He was the winning quarterback of the football team in the 50s, and he was the only person of color in the whole school. I can't even imagine what that's like, in terms of trying to make sense of who you are. I mean, he attests to how he really felt that he was treated well, At the same time, I think there are also, conflicting memories that maybe were too hard to handle. His friends told him that one time they walked into a bowling alley and they weren't let in because of him. He doesn't remember this incident at all, but his friends refused to go in. They turned away because he was being rejected, so it was a moment of alliance for them. So it'll be really, interesting how this film gets to be a way for older people to have a conversation amongst themselves now about what they had to endure. Like in California, 120,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned. What did their neighbors and what did their friends do, to help them or to extend the abuse, and the oppression?
No, and it brings up, it kind of brings me to wanting to discuss, what's central to the mission of our festival, which is not just simply to bring well-made films, which this is certainly a well-made film, but we want to bring films that we hope when the lights come up, people will sit up a little taller in their seats, will take something from what they have seen back into their own lives, back into their communities. Some films have, calls to action, curricula that go with them. We're always interested in what the impact, might be. If you have some thoughts about, how you do see this film affecting people, taking some action, positive action, joining that conversation.
As a scholar of race and film, I'm ever conscious of how there's a very long history, from the birth of cinema itself, where this medium has really harmed people. I think about Birth of a Nation and how it re-galvanized the KKK, and after the release of the film, the increase in lynchings. There's real impact in the world making that we see in movies. And so every film that attempts to bring justice and redress to that kind of harm, I think is a very important solution, a very important action. And in the filmmaking process itself, the collaborative nature of it, the learning process that you undergo, whether it's in the editing, there are many beautiful sequences in the film where the editor just did such a magical job of illustrating what does it mean to be Japanese American. And the way he did it was, he enacted these beautiful dissolves from different kinds of outfits that really showed how, Kiyo, one of the lead subjects of the film, was so comfortable being Japanese American. There was no contradiction in that identity in the 1930s San Francisco, because, she could dress in whatever way she wanted with equal comfort, So he did that. And, Rosa Park, the sound editor, she was really able to actualize, the historical footage through sound, and put music in or take music away, depending on the scene. So there's something so intimate and so much about learning how to recognize each other in the process of making a film, of being accountable to a community when you're making a film. And so, the call to action in this film is really something very intimate. It's really an encouragement, to talk inside your families about your own histories, and it's also an invitation to look around your own cities, where you're growing up, and to think about what happened there, and to find out, in order to undo, the traumas of those experiences by confronting them, So in a sense, I think this film is really about respectful listening, respectful speaking, respectful observation, and hopefully to ignite, a desire to preserve history and to use film to address that harm, to change that harm. What's the opposite of harm? In some ways, I think it is to establish peace, to make sense of that trauma so it doesn't hurt, and that, we account for that experience and to make meaning out of it, that gives us solace, especially as we pass things on and empower the next generations, to claim their inheritance, to take care of their story.
That's really lovely. Beyond the screening at the Global Peace Film Festival, how can people find this film? What's happening with this film? What can people do to support this and other of your work? And can you tell us what's next for you?
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be included in the Global Peace Film Festival because precisely of your mission of a more just and peaceful world. The film will be included in several film festivals, the Catalina Film Festival, the Portland Film Festival, the Seattle Film Festival. We have a very robust website, 80yearslater.film. I'd never seen the .film web link before, but that's where we are, 80 years later, .film. So you can see clips, trailers, download photos, and just enjoy further what the film is about. I am working on a next project. As Kelly said earlier, Nina, I'm both an academic, a scholar, and a filmmaker. So my next film is at first really going to be a book. And it's currently about in the flesh of hypersexuality. You know, hypersexuality is really an attribution that describes Asian American women, you know, for the past 100+ years, you know, that Asian American women have a proclivity for perverse sexuality that's frightening and powerful, you know, and you'll see this in the way the Atlanta, you know, shooter, you know, justified his actions by saying that there was the sexuality that Asian American women had that drove him mad, you know, that became the kind of source of fear for him, you know. So I'm thinking a lot about, you know, this concept of hypersexuality because I've written about it in the past in film. And now I'm going to take it to the ground and really ask Asian American women how they live in the flesh of that attribution. And then I'm going to embark on the scary project of, you know, talking with women about that experience, that everyday on the ground experience. So it'll be a book, and then it'll be a documentary, and we'll see what happens.
Well, Celine, we will definitely stay in touch with you and follow you. We'd love to take any updates we hear from GPFF filmmakers and share them throughout the year through our social media channels. So we're looking forward to those updates. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Nina. I appreciate you so much, and have a wonderful film festival.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who listened to today's Glow. Again, we've had the privilege of speaking with Celine Pereñas Shimizu, the filmmaker behind 80 Years Later. And again, that website is 80yearslater.film. Please do check that out and find out if it will be screening at a festival near you, if you're not in the Central Florida area, to catch it when our in-person screenings begin September 19th and run through September 25th, followed immediately by our virtual online streaming, which begins September 26th and ends October the 2nd. All of the information about our art exhibits and screening schedules can be found at peacefilmfest.org. Thank you again, and we'll see you at the next Glow.